I'm delighted to introduce Professor Gerard Casey. He's Ireland's leading libertarian thinker. He's a Professor Emeritus at UCD. And Gerard, why not just let you introduce yourself? You know yourself a little better than I do.
Right. Well, I'm not sure I do. The essence of wisdom, as the Greeks used to say, is to know yourself, and I'm not sure I'm all that wise. Anyway, just for anyone who doesn't know me, I spent most of my life as a professor of philosophy at University College Dublin. Before that, I taught at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C. I got my PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and I'm Irish, obviously, by birth. Spent 8 years in the States and came back here in '86. So I'm a kind of a late convert to libertarianism. If you were to ask me what I was before that, I'd find it hard to say. Nothing particular probably would be the correct answer. I had a kind of conversion to it, which we may talk about later, but it was quite late, as it were, in my career. So that's pretty much me. That's it.
Gerard, you've been very good. You've allowed us to badger you into reading a little tract from one of your books to give us a concrete idea of libertarianism that we can all share, starting the conversation here. Would you mind telling us from which book you're reading?
Well, this isn't actually from a book. This is from an article I wrote called Let the Poor Starve. I gave it as a paper up in Queens back in 2018, and I revised it slightly. It really had to do with how libertarian relates to social welfare, but it begins with a very brief account of libertarianism, and that's what I'm going to read. But I would be very happy, by the way, to send this to anybody who wants it. The best way to do it is by email. So anybody who wants it can email me at gerardcasey68@icloud.com. That's Gerard Casey, all one word, 68, all one word. Gerard Casey, numeral 68@icloud.com.
Okay, Gerard, I actually read this myself and I posted it just this week. I thought it was an excellent introduction as well. So I'm quite happy you'll give that a read. If you don't mind, Gerard, give that a read for us, please.
Okay, this is just the first page in case anybody's worried. Okay, so anyway, here we go. So I'm a terrible person. Many people will actually agree with that judgment. I'm white, I'm old, I'm male, I'm socially conservative, I'm Catholic, and I'm heterosexual, or at least I was the last time it was an issue. Okay, all these are terrible things to be, but worst of all than all of these, I'm a libertarian, which means, of course, that to the kind of the uninitiated, I spend all of my time promoting and defending drug taking, and that's only when I'm not actively oppressing the poor. Ah, yes, what would life be like without my 20 cups of tea a day while I grind my heel into the face of the poor and the oppressed of this world? So what is all this libertarian nonsense? It's actually very simple. And here it is. The fundamental principle of libertarianism is the zero aggression principle. And it goes like this. No one, whether as an individual or as a member of a group, may initiate or threaten to initiate the use of physical violence, aggression, against the person or property of another. And that's it. That's in essence the sum and substance of libertarianism. Now, it should be noted, by the way, that while the zero aggression principle is a minimal political principle, it's most definitely not the whole of morality. For example, if I were to say that water is essential to human life, it wouldn't imply that there weren't more interesting and attractive things to drink. And so too, the zero aggression principle is a constituent element of any defensible system of morality, but it isn't and doesn't set out to be a comprehensive moral system. In fact, libertarianism is consistent with a whole variety of moral positions. Utilitarianism, consequentialism, deontology, and perhaps more significantly, for the purposes of this talk, is actually consistent with both social radicalism and social conservatism. I'm also, by the way, socially conservative. And by the way, it doesn't mean, of course, that you have to do drugs or morally approve of drug taking, which I don't, of course, except for drinking large quantities of tea. So libertarianism, then, pure and simple, is the least aggressive and least committal of all the positions that one can take in respect of politics. Almost all political theory set out to answer the question, what is the best, or at least the least worst, system of government? Libertarianism, in contrast, asks the much more fundamental question about the legitimacy of any form of government. calling into question any form of government or governance that is premised on the denial of the zero aggression principle. In other words, any form of government that is based ultimately on aggression. Now, all non-libertarian, we see this all the time, of course, all non-libertarian form of politics are zero-sum games in which individuals and groups compete to capture and control the coercive power of the state. In non-libertarian politics, if my gang wins, my gang being the collection of individuals who have persuaded more suckers to vote for us than voted for the members of your gang, then it gets to set the rules and use force to make you and everybody else obey, or else. Some people will say, well, you can vote in elections, so you have a choice. Well, you do have a choice, which is to play the game as it's set up, to choose between one gang and another. What you don't have a choice to do, of course, is to step out of the game altogether and refuse to endorse any and every gang. Now, here's an important question I think people should ask themselves. They might say, I'm not a libertarian. I reject the zero aggression principle. But here's the question. Do you feel lucky? I feel like Clint Eastwood. Do you punk? No, sorry, that's the wrong question. The question you must ask yourself is, do I in fact reject the zero aggression principle? Because if you do, you must be prepared to accept the consequences of that rejection. For example, if you don't subscribe to the zero aggression principle, then you are willing, in principle and in practice, to initiate violence or to threaten to initiate violence against non-aggressive human beings, to force them to act in certain ways, or more often, to prevent them from acting in certain ways. Your willingness to do this has the consequence that, just a moment here, that you cannot object to others being willing to initiate violence to prevent you from acting in certain ways or forcing you to act in certain ways, should they be in a position to do so. And who is to say what those actions might be? Positively, you might be forced to participate, for example, in wars of aggression. Negatively, you might be forced to refrain from, well, I'll let you use your imagination here. So here you have a choice. You either accept the zero aggression principle and become a libertarian, or recognize that you already are a libertarian, even though you didn't realize it, or, on the other hand, reject the zero aggression because you are prepared to use physical violence or the threat of it against those who pose no aggressive threat to you or to others. And as a consequence, be prepared to find yourself at the mercy of the whims of those who are individually or collectively stronger than you, with no possibility of availing of any principled avenue of resistance. Which will it be? You decide. So now there are every libertarian knows that there are a whole host of trivial and wearisome objections to libertarianism of the form, but what about blank, blank, blank? Like, what about the roadsman? Who will build the roads? Whatever about what might people ask, and I'm not trying to eliminate those, but I would just say that the most significant intellectual objection to libertarianism relates to the provision of law, justice, and security. And it's here where libertarians divide. So they divide into those who think that the provision of law, justice, and security can only be supplied by a monopoly provider, and those are people generally called minarchists. And then there are those who, like me, believe that law, justice, and security, too, can be provided for by free association and cooperation among individuals and groups that they voluntarily subscribe to, and they are libertarian anarchists. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much it. That's the sort of idiot's guide to libertarianism.
Well, if you're looking for idiots, you've come to the right place. Because I am out of questions. Good night, everybody. No, that was brilliant. Thank you for that brilliant overview, and it gives us a couple of interesting jumping off points. Could I ask you, Gerard?
Yes.
Then, so we're going to take everything as is, the world as is, the political systems as are. There are liberals. So when we talk about using the power of the state, and libertarians would reject this. And what makes you different, I suppose, is that liberals and conservatives, so that's leaving libertarians aside, both use the power of the state, but they would use them in quite different ways. You talked earlier, or just what you put in there, that you're personally a socially conservative libertarian. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me, first of all, how you see the liberal and the conservatives both using the power of the state negatively, and then how you get around that as a libertarian.
All right, let me see if I can what I can do here. Let's take an example. Probably the preeminent conservative philosopher of the end of the last and the beginning of this 20th century, which is Roger Scruton, an immensely impressive chap.
Okay.
I met him on a few occasions. He's now dead, of course, and God rest his soul. But anyway, he and I were at a conference in all places, Mullingar, of some years ago, and he was giving a paper. I was giving a paper, and when he very kindly came to mine, and when I'd finished and we had a conversation, I said to him, Roger, look, it seems to me that on almost all social issues, you and I think exactly alike, right? The importance of the family and so on and so forth, all of these things, right? The necessity for manners, good manners, and the regulation of our social conduct by social norms and all of these things, right? I said the only difference is, and it's an important difference, is as a libertarian anarchist, I'm not prepared to use the power of law. Okay, I'm not prepared to use force to force people to do things or to refrain from doing things. And if you're a political conservative, that's what you are prepared to do. Now, to come back to your starting point of your question, the difference between political liberals, using the term liberal, by the way, in its modern kind of American sense rather than the classical liberal, and political conservatives differ. By and large, political liberals want absolute freedom when it comes to, say, sexual morality and various other things, and they want to regulate your life and your businesses and engage in high taxation and enforce their image of the way the world should be, whether it's in relation to climate change or whatever it might be, by law, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
all. Political conservatives, on the other hand, tend to be sort of more relaxed when it comes to economic matters, but they tend to want to enforce. This is obviously a broad stroke to him, but they tend to want to enforce their morality, the standards of morality, on people, whether they like it or not. And just to come back to my conversation with Roger Scruton, I said my objection to political conservatism is twofold. One, it's wrong. It's the most important one. And secondly, it's actually counterproductive, because if you engage in coercive repression of people with whatever good intentions you might have, the tendency is of people to resist those. And if ever you lose power, okay, you tend to get a reaction that swings the pendulum tends to swing very far on the other side, which is not at all what any political conservative or social conservative, for that matter, would want. Okay,
So
I don't
there's
know what.
always going to be a tension between the liberals and conservatives, which can't be reconciled.
Indeed.
Because of this, point scoring, this swing and counter swing of the pendulum.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, like in my younger days, I used to do a bit of radio and TV work, and as we approached the new millennium, the RTE still, for some reason, had me on their call list. And eventually, when they would call me up and ask me if I would come on a program, I would say, "Look, I will come on your program, but what will happen will be this: you will have set up, you will have cast your contributors into two groups who are opposing each other, right? And you expect me to join one of these groups. But the problem is that when the conversation starts, I'm going to say both of these parties actually agree, for example, on the use of force. They only differ about what they should use it for. My approach, of course, hits this at right angles. Okay. I'm not in this particular game. And so both of these groups are going to look at me like I've got five heads and then ignore me for the rest of the conversation. So do you want me to come on still? And the answer generally was no.
Well, I think in the Irish scene in particular, but in probably, I guess maybe in America it's more evolved in that way, but there is no room for that in the Irish scene, even now. I think that it's still very binary that way. And actually, the conservative side of the argument has disappeared entirely, even with that.
Oh, yes, indeed. In fact, you could say that what you get is kind of liberal light and liberal slightly lighter. Okay,
right.
so.
Right. Could I ask you, so if we have the rejection of the power, using the power, wielding the power of the state. So for libertarians, the law has no business enforcing moral considerations, you said. That's the way you put it in your book that I have here in front of me, Libertarian Anarchy, which everyone should read. And we have the non-aggression policy. Could we maybe, I think it would be useful to go, could you provide, because you've done it in your book here, it's very hard for us to imagine a world or a political system beyond what we have now, or incremental changes to it, without violent revolution, without that kind of violent anarchy. Could you provide us with an almost idealistic, or you did a good job with, you mentioned Inuit tribes and Celtic tribes. Could you build up what the idealized libertarian society could be? And I'm thinking here about mutual agreement and mutual benefit in particular.
All right, I mean, I'll do my best, but maybe I could paint a sort of big picture first, because I think it's important to see that before we get into anything like detail. Okay, look, there's a classic old joke. This was in the days when Gardaí used to do point duty, on O'Connell Bridge. And the old joke is that this guy comes to him from the country and says, "Could you direct me to, I don't know, Donamead or something like this," right? And the guard is kind of scratching his head and not having a lot of luck. And he said, "Sir, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." Okay. Now, we don't have a choice. We are where we live. We live in the world in which we live. This is a world in the 21st century which has been constructed in the form of initially the modern nation state, and then supranational groups of various kinds, including the Russian Federation, the American, whatever you want to call it, and now the European Union, and various other non-aligned persons. And the state is such a core element of our thinking that it's almost impossible for us to conceive of what the world would be like without it. But here you have to think, for example, the human beings are, I don't know how old we are, but let's say we're 500,000 in the present form. Human beings have lived without states for most of that time and somehow managed to survive. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we go back, or that it's possible to go back. I'm just suggesting that it's not necessary for our survival. But in any event, so we are where we are, all right? Libertarians want to go to a world in which there are no coercive states. It doesn't mean a world, by the way, in which there are no forms of governance, because those forms of governance are the kinds of things we create ourselves for welfare. I mean, there may be some libertarians whose idea of the good life is to kind of live in the wood and kind of eat squirrel. That's not me. Okay, I want to live with other people in society. I want to benefit from their work, and they have the benefit from mine, and so on and so forth. I want people, all of these things. So that's where I want to go. The question is, how much external coercive governance do we need in order for that to happen? And the answer is not a lot. So those are two extremes, where we are now and where we'd like to be. And the question is, how can we possibly get from one to the other, right? And the answer is with great difficulty. But let me sort of give a big picture answer to that question. The first service, allegedly, that the state provides is the provision of law, justice, and security. That will be the last thing to disappear from the state's control. By the way, I don't know if you know, do you know how much of our GDP we spend on justice in the Irish Republic?
I don't.
Yeah, what would you guess in terms of percentages? I mean, remember, this is the core function of the state, right?
We're talking now where we're talking about, the migration, IPAS and all that under the provision of
I'm just talking about courts and police and all of that sort of stuff.
10%.
Yeah, 5. Okay.
Oh, I was upscaling because I was expecting a shock.
Yeah, it's about 5%. It may be 6. Okay, so don't call me a liar if it's 6, but it's around about that.
Sure.
So the bulk of the money that the government takes from us in tax goes on health, welfare, and education. And so let's start at the top, because the latest addition to the state's enterprises were the state's active participation in the market in the form of what we call in Ireland semi-state bodies. These were setting up effectively industries sponsored by and de facto controlled by the government, even if they were nominally under the control of a board. I'm glad to say that by and large, the movement has already started and is on the way to get rid of these. When I was growing up as a boy, I tell this story to people from America, and they're kind of puzzled. If you wanted a telephone, right, you had to apply to the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would wait, unless you were a doctor, you would wait probably around 2 years before they would supply you with one.
Okay.
Okay. They would then come and they would install it in your house wherever it suited them, usually in the hall where you get pneumonia while you were on the phone. They would then charge you more or less whatever they liked. You would never get an itemized bill. Okay.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah. Oh no, this was the world I grew up in. When I went to the States back in 1978, where did I go? 78. And I was staying. Some people there were kind of looking after me, and they said the guy I was with said, "Would you like a telephone in your apartment?" And I said, "Yes." I was kind of puzzled. He said, "Oh, okay. Are you doing anything right now?" And I said, "No, I'm finished for the day." So he said, "Okay, let's go." And I go with him, and we get in his car. We go downstairs. We go downtown to Indiana Bell. And 15 minutes later, I come out with a brown paper bag, and there's a telephone apparatus and a telephone book. And then I go back to my apartment. The next day he says, "Well, how's your phone?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm waiting to be connected." He said, "What?" I said, "I'm waiting to be connected." And he said, "Do you have something like this?" And he showed me the socket in the wall. I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you have a plug like this on the end of your phone line?" And I go, "Yes." He said, "Well, why don't you just plug it in?" Okay. So this was, I can't really get across to people just how much of a psychic shock this was to me. I mean, this is unbelievable. So yeah. So anyway, to come back to my main point, which is that gradually speaking, not to the extent and certainly not as fast as it should, the state is getting out of the business of actually being in private enterprise, right? We still have semi-state bodies. And I mean, the health service here is effectively run by a semi-state body. And it's, of course, a disaster, just as it is in the UK. But anyway, that in a sense, we're on the way to getting rid of that. The next thing we need to get rid of, the really big money spenders and the things that for which we are taxed extravagantly are, I already mentioned health, education and welfare are enormous. And by welfare, I don't just mean social welfare, I also mean corporate welfare, right? In other words, that's supporting businesses that are allegedly too big to fail, like banks, for example.
Right.
Okay. All of that needs to go. So when you get rid of all of that, which we hopefully will someday, but not before probably I die, okay, we'll be left with law, justice, and security. And this is where libertarians divide. Some libertarians, for example, like Ludwig von Mises and others, think that you need a minimal state, what used to be called for the classical liberals, the kind of night watchman state that will provide law, justice, and security. There can only be one provider of those services in any given area, as it were, right? And by the way, if somebody said to me, "Casey, I have here a button, okay, and if you press it, we will go from where we are now to the night watchman state. Would you press it?" And the answer is, "I've just burnt my finger with the speed in which I hit that button." Okay, I'd be there so fast. Okay, it would be such an improvement on where we are now. Okay, but I'm hard to please, and I would think that even those services, and this is kind of like an intra-libertarian fight, and it's one of these things that like attracts libertarian nerds. They love to hone in on these, while everybody else is trying to figure out what the hell libertarianism is. I mean, the minarchists and the anarchists are sort of duking it out to see who can, as it were, make the best case. I think anarchism in the end is feasible and ultimately more justifiable. But I would freely concede, by the way, that minarchism, namely the position that you would need a minimal state for the provision of law, justice, and security, is actually easier to sell. It's easier to sell to the general public. So that's a sort of large scale kind of, right? Now, within that, there's all sorts of movements, okay? And so let me just make one final remark, and then you can come back in on this, which
Go
is
ahead.
that...
No, it's great. I'm enjoying listening.
The point is this. Look, I mean, Murray Rothbard, one of the great libertarians of our time, once said, he described somebody he called the Beltway libertarian. The Beltway is like the M50, the road that runs around Washington, D.C., right? And she says, you get some guy, he's in college, he's introduced to libertarianism, he's all excited. He goes off to work for a think tank in Washington, and he's like, really enthusiastic about libertarianism. And 5 years later, he's on the kind of cocktail party circuit, and his main concern is whether or not we can reduce income tax by 1/4%. And he's kind of forgotten all his initial enthusiasm for so the whole aim here is that the whole idea is, look, there are two.
Why is that? Why does that enthusiasm? That is it just part of the naivety of youth?
Well, it's you're meeting all of these people and they're all sophisticated, and when you tell them how much of a libertarian you are, they kind of smile at you and pat you on the head and kind of go, well, we were all libertarians once upon a time, and we kind of get over.
Living within that system that seems so insurmountable to break down.
Indeed, you become part of the system whether you like it or not, and it's just, it's perfectly understandable.
Of course.
There are two. I mean, the goal of libertarianism, which is the either minarchism or anarchism, depending on which variety it goes, should be achieved in two ways. There should be two principles that govern it, as far as I'm concerned. Now, people may disagree with me on this. One is it should be achieved as quickly as possible. Okay, not in 55,000 years, for example. Okay. The other thing is it should be achieved with as little disruption as possible. And those principles kind of run across each other at right angles. For example, you could minimize the disruption by having your change take place over 1 million years. Okay. Or you could maximize your disruption, you maximize your destruction and maximize the speed by pressing a button and going from the where we are now to pure libertarianism, as it were, in the blink of an eye. Neither of those is desirable. And so the stages I talked about, in other words, getting rid of the state enterprises and so on, getting rid of the big money spenders, health, education, and welfare, okay, and then coming back to the question of law, justice, and security. That's what you need to do. And I think that's actually feasible. Not that I expect it to happen tomorrow, but there we are.
For you, Gerard, too, it's not just like you were saying, there's some college idea of what libertarian is. It's a profound moral issue. I was, again, something that struck me when I was reading this Libertarian Anarchy, your book. You started out, first of all, as one of the best starts to a book you'll find. States are criminal organizations, all states, not just the obviously totalitarian or repressive ones. But you go on to say how, theft, robbery, kidnapping, and murder are all crimes. And then you find the state guilty of all of these things. And convincingly so. But one of them that stuck out to me just in this particular moment in time that we're living in. You wrote, what of compulsory school attendance? Libertarians rejected. State-enforced school attendance is a form of involuntary incarceration that violates the right of both parents and children. This, you see, would have sounded a little bit out there to a lot of people, I think, even a couple of years ago. But then along came COVID. Yes. And here in Germany, it is compulsory that all children attend a public school. Homeschooling is illegal in Germany, and it's strictly enforced to the point where during COVID, when there was dissenters who didn't want to wear masks or had whatever issues, they tried to set up homeschooling cliques or communes, whatever you want to call it. There was a case very close to me here in South Baden-Württemberg where a number of parents had set up a school. And I'm an educator. I'm a teacher. I taught in the IBO system, the International Baccalaureate system. But they were raided by heavily armed riot squad. We're talking about the kind of guys who are put normally into terrorist events. And it was to make a very strong and clear impression. It was to say that, in this moment, where there's a risk of public breakdown of law and order, this is how it's going to be. You will do this. But it struck me, and it was a turning point for a lot of parents too here, because it even surprised them just how thin just how coercive the relationship between state and individual can get.
Yeah, I know. It's quite extraordinary. By the way, this to some extent comes from my personal experience. I hated school. Okay. primary school wasn't too bad, but secondary school was torture for me. And when I finished and the gates closed behind me, I felt like I'd been released from prison. Okay. And I swore I'd never go to another educational establishment again. Well, how did that work out? Okay.
Interesting.
But it is quite extraordinary. I mean, in America, for example, the public school system was set up in some states explicitly, by the way, in opposition to religious schools, right? And the idea was, yeah, so the state schools are state schools. They have a state curriculum. They have state-appointed and state-approved teachers. Okay, and one of the things, I mean, that many people you wouldn't have found shocking even recently, but you might now, which is, for example, in America, we have children taking the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the government for which it stands. Okay, one nation under God, indivisible. Okay.
Now we're kind of groomed, and even here in Europe through movies, Hollywood movies, and whatever, to say that's brilliant, that's great, but you would have an issue.
Yeah. Okay. I've had an issue. So it is quite extraordinary. And in fact, another. I mean, I think maybe people on the other side of the kind of social fence might find this not acceptable, but it might resonate with them, which is that this. I'm not opposed to education, by the way, but education and schooling are not the same thing. Okay, let's make that
Right.
clear for a start. Schooling is schooling and education is education. And they may actually connect at some stage, but not necessarily. There are many people who are autodidacts who have taught themselves, who have never gone to school. And there are
Right.
many people who've gone through a school system and effectively know nothing. Okay, increasingly, by the way, people who go to universities, right?
Yeah.
So I was going to make a point. I've actually lost my own train of
No,
thought here.
I was saying that, the children saluting the flag and pledging
Oh, yeah.
allegiance to the
Yeah.
state.
So one
That's
of the
offensive to the libertarian.
Yeah, but one of the things the school system was set up for is very interesting. Did you notice the way it's constructed? You turn up at a certain time, you leave at a certain time. Your day is divided up rigidly into units, okay, and you learn certain subjects which are dictated not by you, but by some bureaucratic organization in Ireland, the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. And the idea here is effectively to produce workers for the system of the work organization in the state. You get used to doing it. When you go to work, you do exactly the same thing. You turn up at a certain time, you leave at a certain time. You're given the tasks that you are asked to perform, and you perform them, and then you go home. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that these parallel each other. It's quite striking. And human beings didn't used to learn like this. First of all, those who needed to learn skills learned them from their parents, from their mothers or their fathers. Secondly, when it came to reading, by the way, this may come as a surprise to you, by the way, but in 19th century America, where people were taught to read by reading the Bible, more people were functionally illiterate than I think are now the case, even with the provision of an extraordinarily expensive and inefficient public schooling system. Right? It's not.
Yep.
It's not difficult. It's not
That
difficult.
doesn't
Sorry.
surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not difficult to teach children to read. And once you can read and write, and by the way, now increasingly, I mean, now you got me on my hobby horse on, okay, which is
Go
that
for it.
the thing is that one of the reasons you had things like universities was that it took an organization of this kind to be able to maintain people who were learned in particular subjects, and also the apparatus, namely a library to which they had access. Not every city could afford to do this, right? But and so they had a kind of gatekeeping function. You had to enter through the gates and be initiated, and then learn to use the system, and so on and so forth. And they controlled the flow of knowledge. That's not been the case for the last 20 years. Okay, right now, for example, pretty much anybody who's interested, can log in, say, to Harvard, to courses given there by the smartest people in particular areas, whether it's computer science or political philosophy or ethics, as the case may be. You don't have to leave your room. You're not stuck in the educational establishment near to you, or you don't have to travel thousands of miles expensively to go somewhere. We have access. You have access to the world's library in your computer right in front of you. All the works, all the works of classics, all the works of the philosophers, the scientists, the papers and so on. And if some things are unavailable, you can normally access them for nominal cost. So the gatekeeping function, if you like, of the educational institutions has effectively disappeared. It's just that the universities haven't realized it yet.
There's a number of things that strike me when you're talking about this. I'm trying to think of his name just off the top of my head. He is an Australian or New Zealander, but again, spent most of his life in Australia, educator who did this meta-analysis of interventions in education to see what works scientifically, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And what he found is that overwhelmingly the number one input to student success is the home environment.
Mm.
You know, everybody was expecting discipline, or whatever fancy teaching methods, whatever. And he found, no, it's the home environment. And that has, what chem is a shock, but shouldn't have been a shock. And it should never be a shock. And it should always be the root of any education system that we have. And you put in mind there another thing, another study I remember reading, and I found it fascinating. And it was, because again, I shared, without knowing really a lot about libertarianism or whatever, just from my own personal experience, I came to a lot of similar conclusions. Like one being, like you talked there about education and how it's training for industrial work, you know, everything from the mind numbingness of sit down, head down, take order, be punctual, do, that. I noticed as well very early on how similar that was to the prison system, and how these, of course, are all institutions, you know.
Well, that's why I use the word incarceration.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, right? That you can actually, I'll just say this point, and then I would like you to maybe even talk about or connect those 2 points again about the state, essentially how the state is the state a moral body. But what I noticed was, this was for, I just wrote about it once upon a time. Anyway, there was a study that came out of a university in Manchester. It's not the university in Salford. They did this study where they looked at the effects of the physical environment on student learning. And they found everything. They found a number of fascinating things, like the temperature, lower temperature kept students alert. They learned better. They learned, they looked at color patterns on boards, walls, things like this. And they compared this as well. There was a famous study, it was overhyped to a degree, but there was a famous study that they showed that in some prison system in Texas, that when they painted the walls pink, had the inmates going around pink, that violent crimes dropped, things like this. Now, I got all excited at the time because I was thinking, here's ways that we can help students learn by tweaking their environment or whatever. And it was only later that I was able to step outside of it and say, whoa, they're just lab rats. Why am I getting excited about tweaking the environments of lab rats, be it the prison inmate or the student? That there's something wrong when I'm talking about tweaking the physical environment of an institution to get reaction A or B out of them. That it's a profound thing when you realize that you can experiment essentially as if they are a cohort of just lab rats. And that tells me, that was the first moment when I got a pit in my stomach and realized that, wait a minute, we've got some issues here. But to go back to what you were talking there about the relationship about, incarceration of the state. So school coercion is just one form, and the prison system.
Yep. Hello?
Yeah, Gerard, we hear you.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, I thought we'd lost track. So was that a question there? I didn't quite get that.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to ask you, could you just, you explained how the school system is a form of coercion by the state. Could you talk to us about the prison system and how you would have a moral issue with the prison system?
Well, maybe I can back up the truck, to use George Hook's phrase here for a moment and so on. Look, people say anarchism is all very well as a kind of an idea, but it wouldn't work. And my answer is, try walking down Grafton Street. And they go, what? And I go, look, as you walk down Grafton Street, people are walking in two directions on every part of the road. So what happens? Does everybody bash into everybody? Well, occasionally you will, if somebody is watching what they're doing. By and large, people see each other coming and move to one side, And if they do any of these exotic dances that we sometimes do, you know, when you go to your left and the person coming towards you goes to his right, okay, you don't normally sort of punch them in the face. You sort of smile, apologize, and move on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of what we do in every day is actually anarchic. That is to say, it's governed by social codes of various kinds and spontaneous actions. And we do this without even thinking about it. In fact, I came across a very early newsreel film of Cork from about 1908, and I was interested to see that everybody was driving everywhere. There were horses and carts and donkeys and bicycles, people strolling across the Grand Parade, and there was no left and no right, and nobody was killing each other. Now, of course, obviously, when the speed increases, you have to decide, generally speaking, which side of the road you're going to be driving on. It doesn't really make any difference whether you go on the right or the left. It does make a difference, however, if in the morning, if the general convention is to go on the left, you decide for, I don't know, to be spontaneous, to go on the right. That's going to be exciting. Okay. But generally speaking, for most of our lives and in most ways, we organize ourselves spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Most of our social life, by the way, is organized. We behave ourselves and behave well to other people, not because we fear the law or legal consequences, but because we are socially adapted. We grow up learning how to relate to other people. So an example I use frequently is, and we notice this, by the way, when things break down. So let's go back to Grafton Street, my favorite place. So you're walking down Grafton Street and you see somebody who is enormously overweight, and you're thinking to yourself, "Ooh, that person, you know, either eats a whole lot or they've got some glandular problem or whatever it might be." You don't, generally speaking, feel obliged to go up to them and say, "My God, you're enormously fat."
No, no.
Right? I mean, you could, but most of us don't. And we don't do it because the person's going to punch us in the nose or we're going to get arrested for it and so on. It's just that we've been brought up properly. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we learn how to behave and how to minimize social friction, and we learn the norms of conduct. And you only realize this, how much this is the case when you run across people who are improperly socialized. Go back to the example I used earlier. I mean, I don't know if, sorry, if this is before we went on air, but in normal human speech, there's what's known as phatic communication, Phatic. So it's when you meet somebody and you say, "How are you?" And they say, "Oh, I'm not too bad. How are you?" And you say, "Oh, I'm grand," and so on. Now, what's going on here? This is not an exchange of information. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is simply a way of saying, "I recognize you as a human being worth talking to," and the other person says, "I recognize you as a person worth talking to." And then, if you want to talk about other things, you will go on to do it. The person who's been improperly socialized, when asked, "How are you?" will actually tell you about all their ailments and the operation they had recently and so on. And you're thinking, "What? I don't want to know any of this." Okay, this is not what "how are you" means. Okay, so I mean, you know, and so I'll give you another example. Just recently,
Just social cues, yeah.
it's social cues. I was having lunch down in Kilkenny with a friend, and the person serving was a young lad of about 17 or 18, and Irish, right? And this is important, okay, because like in Ireland, we engage in banter,
Mm-hmm.
and so I said something like to him, I said, "When you ring the bell, make sure you give it to the guy sitting opposite me, right?" And he laughed, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And then I said, "Is it true that the food here is free today?" And so on. So we you know, I mean, this is not high class.
Yeah,
This is
sure.
not high this is not high class comedy or anything, right? But and he responded in kind, and when he came back, he said something like, "Well, you know, I'm going to charge you, but this guy gets it free," or whatever. And this went on and so when we finished and we settled the bill, and he said to us, and I thought this was interesting. He said, "Thanks," he said, for making my day entertaining." Okay.
Mm.
Now, if I were to try that with people who are not Irish, okay, I would be met by a blank stare. Okay, right? They don't
Oh,
understand
yeah.
I'm bald. I
Yeah.
don't mean these sentences to be taken literally. Okay, I'm not actually
Right.
suggesting that the food is free. Okay, these are ways of socially engaging, and but not everybody plays these games. And but as well, this is not a moral fault or anything. It's just one of these things. And when you go to another culture or society, even ones you think I'm sure you probably experienced this yourself, Owen, in Germany. So you know when they don't do everything in the same way.
No.
Okay, and you can inadvertently transgress social norms without
Hmm.
realizing that,
Hmm.
and I'm sure you've probably done that. Okay,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah. So most of our life is lived in this anarchic environment, which doesn't mean it hasn't got rules or regulations. It just means that the regulations don't come from on high by a superior force and are punished, as it were, by incarceration. If you misbehave socially, the punishment is that people will increasingly refuse to associate with you. I mean, if you have disgusting table manners or personal habits or hygiene, generally speaking, you tend to lose your friends.
You
If you ever
brought
had
up
it, if
something
you
very, very important there, though, Jared. First of all, just to finish this thought to its conclusion, but you brought up something very important. So let's, in the libertarian state, okay, or in if we're trying to move away from the system as is now, but what happens when somebody does break the non-aggression policy? What happens? How in the libertarian state do we handle? Not let's not go straight to murder, but drunken assault, violent assault, something like that.
okay, well,
Um,
actually, let us go to murder and
okay, yeah,
homicide,
go ahead, go ahead.
and let me tell you how did they deal with it. For example, in medieval Ireland, well, they didn't have a state, and they didn't have a police force, and they didn't have jails. Okay,
Mhm.
okay. So here's how it worked. And by the way, this is common in other traditional societies as well, in different forms. Um, so, in fact, in the Anglo-Saxon thing, they used to have a thing called Wehrgeld, which is like the German, which meant man money. Okay, so if everybody was a member of their familial or kin group, okay, by obviously by birth, right? So if you killed or injured somebody who was a member of another group, you would be held responsible. And if you had done it, so there were courts, okay, and the court could render a verdict. The courts, by the way, weren't coercive. Nobody had to go to them. But if you did and they rendered a verdict, the verdict was not enforceable by the court, but by you, right? And by and large, if it was discovered that, for example, a member of your kin group had wrongly killed a member of another one, that person, these people had a right to kill one of yours. Now, this is not conducive to social life. So generally, the um, the punishment was commuted, as it were, to money. That's where the Vergeld comes in. Okay, or in the case of medieval Ireland, it would have been cattle, and it would have been quite sizable. Now, if a member of your kinship group was reckless about this and given to going to the local pub and starting fights and assaulting people and killing people, it's going to cost your kinship group quite a bit. And eventually they're going to say, we're not responsible. Now,
Mhm.
what happens then? The person effectively becomes an outlaw. What you're saying is, if anyone takes action against this person, including killing them, we undertake not to engage in retribution.
All right.
All right. So what
It's
happens now? Well,
interesting.
if you're this guy and your kinship group, as it were, has basically washed their hands of you and you have effectively become an outlaw, will you A, hang around, we'll see what happens, okay, or would you get the hell out of there? And the
Mhm.
answer is you got out of there. And the one rule, by the way, which no king, none of the local Irish kings was allowed to dispense with, was giving shelter to a criminal, somebody who was on the run from another thing. So effectively, you were ostracized from society. Now, clearly, I'm not talking about reintroducing this here, okay? But let's come down. Let's come back to the system of let's take something less serious than homicide. Right now, if somebody breaks into your house and steals your television set, what will happen? Well, you'll call the cops. They may come, they may not. Okay. But
Yeah.
if they do, they will say, you will say, well, can I get my TV back? And they laugh. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Because this is a joke.
Increasingly
And,
so.
and, you
Yeah.
know, and you know, by the way, that even if it turns out that they actually apprehend the guy who nicked your TV, the chances of him being charged are slim.
Yeah.
The charges of him being, if charged, being convicted are slim. And the chances of him being charged, convicted, and sentenced and punished are extremely slim. And the chances of you getting your TV back are non-existent. So, in fact, even though we have a complicated and sophisticated legal system, by and large, we are actually all responsible for the defense of our own selves and property, by and large. In other words, nobody's going to be doing it for you. You don't walk around with your own personal policeman. Okay, and as I said, if your property gets stolen, largely you're on your own. Your chances of getting it back are practically non-existent. Now, what people have done today, just to give you an example of how might this work in practice, is if you had a private defense association that you were paying yourself voluntarily, okay, they're not extracting taxes from you, then they're responsible for protecting you. They would police your area. They would put a sign up in your house saying the Acme Protection Company, right? And this company, you would give this company the right to pursue anybody who stole your stuff. They also, however, would provide you with insurance effectively, so that if your TV was stolen, part of the deal is that they would replace the stolen material. And therefore, they have a really strong interest in ensuring that nobody steals your stuff. But they also have an interest in making sure that they pursue anybody who's engaging in these activities, so that anybody who's walking along the street looking for a house to burgle and sees the Acme Protection Company sign on your house, okay, is likely to avoid it and go to the house next door, right? This is how. Now, if you think this is fantasy, by the way,
No, it's very interesting.
Yeah, but I remember a guy, I met him in the Mises Institute about 10 years ago, and he was actually setting up a company along these lines in Texas, and the charge was going to be something like $50 a month, right? And for this, you got the protection, okay? In other words, people would patrol, okay? And they would pursue in law, and obviously they had to make use of the existing legal system. They hadn't had their own one, right? But they would pursue these people so that anybody who engaged in this, I don't know if you remember the scene in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, when they're being pursued by the Pinkerton guys, right? And no matter where they go, the Pinkerton guys are after them, and eventually they say, "Who are these guys?" Okay,
that's right.
So your local protection company would be like the Pinkerton guys, okay? And they're doing it, by the way, not because they love you. They're doing it because they are engaged in the business, and if they don't do it well, then you will go to some other company. Right.
So
and by the way,
essentially, the police could be privatized.
Of course, it could be privatized.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole look. There's nothing here that a little bit of imagination can't supply. And I used to say to my students, by the way, I mean, when they would raise objections to anarchy, I'd say, who in Ireland is responsible for the growth, production, distribution, and sale of food? Which one person or agency has that responsibility? And they would all scratch their heads. And the reason is very simple. There isn't any. Okay? There isn't any. So what happens is, I mean, does that mean that people around the country just sort of decide to grow anything they like on the chances of something? No, the answer is no. They know what the market's involved. They have an interest in it. If they don't produce what the market wants, they won't sell it and they won't make money. Your local store is competing with other local stores. They cannot say to you, you have an obligation to shop here. You may not shop anywhere else. And we will give you whatever food we think you should have, and we will charge you whatever we like. That's what the government does. Okay. Think about it. The government doesn't allow monopolies. You can't go to another government and say, I wrote a sarcastic letter or ex post, and I said, basically, dear government, I have to tell you, I can't afford your services anymore, so I'm afraid I'll have to give them up. And and I went on. It was quite amusing, I have to say.
That'll go well, yeah.
But the point was, the government doesn't allow. And by the way, there's only one monopolies commission. Did you ever notice that?
The only monopoly is the state monopoly.
Yeah. So here the thing is, I mean, the reason that your local store is happy to provide you with things, and has deals and so on, and it's because it's in competition with other people who are doing the same thing. Yes. And they look at each other and so on, and they compete and they keep their prices down. It's not because they love you. It's not because there's a law there necessarily, right? Even if there were no laws there, they'd still be doing it, right? And that's why if for example a particular item is not available in your store and you bring it to the attention of the manager, generally speaking, it'll appear within a few days. And again, why is that? Is that because they are so admiring of you, okay, that you can command them to do it? And the answer is no. They want your custom. Okay, and therefore we are now. So when you live in a state, you are paying those of us who are paying taxes, not everybody does, but those of us who are, end up paying an enormous amount of money for very inferior services. It's not that you get nothing, you do get something, but it's hit or miss and very inferior. Take the health service, for example. I mean, if you have a health service free at the point of delivery, we don't quite have that, but if you did, you discover that it's great. The trouble is, it takes 3 weeks to get an appointment. I often say sarcastically, I can't schedule my illness 3 weeks in advance.
Mm, that's right.
And so on, and it turns out that more and more people, just like in the university, more and more people are employed in administering the service than actually in doing it and carrying it out.
Right.
Okay, just in the universities, more and more people are engaged in being presidents and vice presidents and deans and so on and so forth.
Right.
And so you do, something does come out at the end. It's not like you get nothing, but you get a very poor service. However, if my doctor is being paid by me directly for a service, or my hospital, okay, whatever it is, my house and so on, being paid by me, then they have to provide a service that I'm satisfied with. Otherwise, I'll go elsewhere. Okay, so I mean, here you've got the kind of basic principles. Now, look, I can't answer all the questions of how you would. This is to end here, right? I can't provide an answer to all the questions of how you would provide all the services. But one of the things that you could do, which would mirror the kinship system of the Middle Ages, is through a system of bonding or insurance. So, for example, if you and I are in business together, if you and I are in businesses and we're planning cooperation, right? But there's lots of money involved, and I'm not entirely sure whether you're going to carry out your end of the bargain or whatever, right? What we would
Yes.
do is we could deposit a bond, each of us, with a third party to whom we gave the right to decide any disputes, right? That would be their business. And therefore, we have an interest in making sure that each of us carries out what it is that we engage in. In fact, what I'm describing here is not something purely fantastical. It is, in fact, the way in which many businesses do business now. They cannot afford to rely on a court system where, if there's a dispute, they may find themselves waiting 10 years for a decision. Right? So very
Mhm.
often what they do is, before they engage in business with each other, they agree on an arbitration company that will decide any disputes that arise between them. And they're quite happy to do that. And they get an answer, and it may not be the one that they wanted, but at least they will get it in time. And it will be given, by the way, if you choose your company correctly, by people who are expert in the area in which you're dealing, which judges very often aren't. Okay.
What you've explained here over the past while um, is essentially this tension between state and nation,
Yes.
and how the waste and bureaucracy of the state and the essential nature of interactions because of the nation, because it's based on the community and kinship.
Hmm.
Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah. I mean, I used to start. One of the ways in which I used to start my lecture series when I was doing anarchy law on the state with my students was, I would say, I'd ask for certain kinds of words, and people would give me state, and they would give me nation, and they would give me politics, and I'd write them all up on all the board, and eventually they kind of got into it. So in the space of 15 minutes, the entire board was covered with all of these words. And I said, well, how do these all relate to one another? Are these all the same thing? Are these all parts of the same thing? Or some subordinate to others? And so one of the questions I would ask is, I mean, is the state the same thing as the nation, or is the nation the same thing as the state?
Mhm.
And the answer is quite clearly no, it's not. Okay, because the word nation comes from the Latin word natus, which means born, and it generally means the society of those people who are born together and live together and grow up together and share a commonality of culture, and law and religion, or whatever it might be. In other words, all of these things together. They're the people you know. It's like when if you're abroad and you hear an Irish accent, even if it's like somebody you wouldn't normally talk to or necessarily seek out if you met them in Ireland, suddenly you kind of realize your commonality with them.
That's right.
Like, oh, this person is from, whatever. Okay, so, but the state, of course, is a political organization. A nation is a cultural organization to that extent. And of course, the two don't necessarily overlap. So one of the disasters of the 19th century was to come up with the idea of the nation state. The idea was that in order that each nation should have its own state, and each state should encompass one and only one nation. But of course, historically, that's never been the case. Even so, if you took, for example, the Holy Roman Empire, you would have had something like 1,000 political
Right.
entities, cities, dukedoms, whatever it might be, of various kinds and sizes, speaking different languages and so on, all under one very vague and remarkably inefficient but very functional entity called the Holy Roman Empire.
Mhm.
Even recently, I mean, if you looked at the empires you used to have, say you had Austro-Hungarian one, which encompassed obviously Austria and Hungary, and indeed what we'd now think of as the Czech Republic or Slovakia, and Russia, of course, encompassed all sorts of nations and so on. So you could have a state with many nations, and you could have a nation divided between different states. There's no reason why this can't happen.
It
But whether
strikes me. It strikes me that we were up until the late 90s an extreme outlier and an extremely unusual group of people because our nation was so homogenous. Our
yes,
nation was, I mean, we were essentially a large village, to use the old cliche. That has rapidly and so rapidly changed now in the past 25 years. What are your thoughts on that, first of all? What are your fears? How can that be reconciled that we are now a nation with going on 25% born overseas, and we're seeing already the origins of micro communities which will be insulated from Ireland and self-sustaining of their own ways?
well, okay, so you have to think about this in the context of the political realities which exist now. Okay, I'm not talking
Yeah,
about this in the context
yeah,
of a
yeah, yeah.
libertarian world. Okay, so first of all, this is not a good thing. Okay, and let me make my point clear here before they get accused of being racist or all sorts of things. Look, if you go to China, right, and you're in one of the Chinese cities, you know what you would expect to see? Lots of
Frenchmen.
Chinese people,
Oh
lots
yeah.
of Chinese people, right? If you saw in Beijing that 2/3 of the population were either white European or black African or subcontinental Indian, you would be astonished.
Yes.
You would be really
Obviously.
surprised.
Yes.
Okay. Similarly, in India, if you go to Mumbai, you would expect to see, wait for it, this is going to come as a big shock to your listeners, you would expect to see Indians. It's not that there wouldn't be an occasional non-Indian, right? Or even
Of
several.
course. Of
You
course.
wouldn't expect to see a statistically significant proportion of the population of any of these places being other than the people who have lived there for a very long time, right? And I don't know why it is that somehow in Europe, where it's considered somehow improper, that we might actually think it would be a good thing if by and large, I'm not talking about any individual again here, let me make this point, I'm talking about numbers because numbers matter. So when you have, as is the case in London, 2/3 of the population in London are not British, native British. That's
Yeah,
striking. There are many places in Britain, for example, in Leeds and Bradford, where you might think you were actually living on the Indian subcontinent.
that's right.
If you're in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, or even in Amsterdam, you would think the same. And
Parts
this
of
is quite
Berlin the
striking.
same.
And it's only, by the way, apparently, so it's okay for China to, if you like, be largely Chinese. It's okay for India to be largely Indian, but somehow it's not appropriate to think that it might be a good thing if in Europe, the majority of the people, okay, in our countries were in fact European. And this is from a cultural, social point of view. Again, it's not, let me emphasize once again, it's not that you can't have a person here or there, or even a small group of people. When the numbers reach a certain level, what you are going to get is social instability. And the kind of smooth functioning that I talked about when I was talking about social norms earlier, the kind of smooth functioning that we get in society. By the way, remember our legal system and our system of law control is premised on the idea that most people will actually obey the law voluntarily. Most people are not out to break the law. They're not
Yes.
doing it, not because they fear punishment, because it's the way they've been brought up. So when you get a large groups of people who are coming from different cultural areas with different cultural norms, you are actually creating a tension which is going to have to be resolved in some way. Now, let me make a difference here because again, I think we need to think about these things and have a conversation. We need to think about ethnicity and culture. They're not the same thing, for example. So people talk about a multicultural society. Well, frankly speaking, you can't have a multicultural society. If by culture you mean anything serious. Look, if somebody from a particular culture wants to eat certain kinds of food, what do I care? It doesn't matter, right? Okay, it's irrelevant. If they want to dye the Chicago River green on St. Patrick's Day, I think it's ridiculous. But hey, okay, go.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
Go for it.
that's not important.
Harming no one, go for it.
But if culture means here the fundamental social, moral, and political norms that on which a society operates, and indeed even religion comes into this too, even if it's ex and post religion, then that is a serious matter. You can't have more than one in the end. Otherwise, they're going to be living side by side and tensions will break out. So we've seen in most societies that people from different races, by and large, tend not, and this is true, by the way, even in the United States, for example, after 150 years after slavery, black people tend to marry black people, white people tend to marry white people and tend to socialize in this way. And they do this, by the way, not because they're prejudiced necessarily, not because they hate people from the other side, though there may be some who do this, because that's just the way people do it. And we like to associate, as it were, with our own. So when you have a situation, as we now have in Europe, where a sizable segment of populations are coming from different races and different ethnicities and different cultures, and are either unassimilated or unassimilable, we have a problem which is going to be worked out one way or the other, and it's not going to be pleasant.
Yeah. Well, we see it here in Germany again. This is why I'm so involved. I see what Ireland is 2 decades down the line because, of Germany's experiences, and I see the tensions and I see the issues that cannot be resolved between groups.
Yeah.
And so it's very sad. So is it fair to say that the Irish state then, aside from being incredibly reckless, aside from being arrogant, not to listen to or look at the experience of their European neighbours, is it also say that it's a moral wrong, a great moral wrong, what they've done here with the
everything they do is immoral, by the way. But yeah, it's not only immoral; it's extremely foolish. Okay, because somebody once said that the cheapest kind of experience you can have is somebody else's. Right? So, in other words, why if you look around, if you plan on doing something, and you know people who've done this and it hasn't worked out well, would you go ahead and do it? And would you think, oh, I'm so special that I can do this and the results will be different? Well, maybe it's possible, but it's unlikely. If everybody who's ever done this project that you attempted, if it ended in disaster, okay, you would be extremely foolish to wait for your own experience to demonstrate this to you. You would look at other people's experience. We do this all the time, by the way. We look around and if we're going to try something, we ask people who've done it and how it works out and so on. And if it's going to involve large outlays of time or money, we're very careful about that. We don't just sort of plunge into it and say, oh, what the hell, whatever happens, happens. That's foolish. But of course, the state is not concerned with its people in that way. I mean, they tend to be an elite who sort of live above the rest of the people and associate with elites in other countries. And so on, and have pretty much nothing. I'm sorry if I sound prejudiced here, but very little but contempt for their alleged the people whose welfare they're supposed to serve. And if there are problems caused here, then they tend not to suffer from them. Okay.
I think the extreme, they went to such an extreme in Ireland too, because first and foremost, they forced this on the people. There was no mandate for this. But secondly, there was this unwritten rule in the first great wave of, mass migration after the war into Central Europe, which was that people were, these groups were largely kept to the more anonymous urban area city, there was at least, you could argue, a basis of anonymity agreed upon that, you can go in here and do whatever. But this Irish government with the IPAS centres in small, ancient, close-knit communities, villages, it seems like a especially egregious sin.
Well, it is. It's remarkably foolish. Okay. I mean, look, I probably should write about this sometime, because people call me all sorts of rude names generally, and they don't bother me. But somebody's going to call one of these days, so they haven't done it already, but call me a racist, and I'm going to say, no, look, let me make it plain. If you're dealing with another human being, another individual human being, whatever their race, whatever their color, whatever their skin color, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their religion, whatever it might be, you're dealing with another human being. Okay, and until it's demonstrated that they are malintentioned, you should treat them with respect and with dignity. So could we make that absolutely clear? Okay, but the whole point, say, for example, of a state is that a state is supposedly responsible for promoting and defending a particular population, not the world as a whole.
Right.
Okay. And so we've seen this, by the way, with J.D. Vance. I'll come back to that in a second. It's quite striking here, because he gave expression to this and it caused all sorts of problems. But so it's responsible for, you would think, primarily for the welfare of its citizens. It doesn't mean if there wasn't an excess and everybody's needs were taken care of, that they couldn't extend that beyond. But by and large, they're responsible for their citizens. Just as in the same way, if you have a family, your primary responsibility is to provide for your family. Right? Okay, that in other words, you can obviously look after some other people. If you have excess income, you can give to charity and support. That's great, but not if it means that your children go short. That doesn't make any sense. Right?
This is what I liked about your writing, and how you build it up from these like the Inuit, or these simple societies, because it gives you exactly what you explained there. The root of libertarianism is essentially the family, the community, the mutual benefit, mutual agreement. The power is with the individual to choose who to interact with or not, as opposed to the state, which is the bus comes in the middle of the night and here are 100 people from you don't know where, and if you don't like it, tough luck. No veto, no consultation. These are so radically different ideas of community, or of life in on an island. They're so radically different.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, people think of the state as their friend, but that's because they have remarkably little to do with it. I mean, remember Ronald Reagan said, he was no anarchist, by the way, or libertarian for that matter, but said 10 most feared words in the English language are, I am from the state and I'm here to help you.
Sure.
Yes.
Gerard, what I would like to do is, first of all, I would like to invite anybody who would like to ask Gerard a question to request a mic, and Aidan will get you set up, because I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Gerard, and he's really stimulated a lot of just great ideas there. And then Gerard, because I want to let you go at some point, I would keep you all night if I could. The last big point, I would love to hear your thoughts on Trump's first, now 2 weeks, right? But he's starting. Is Trump the most libertarian president in your lifetime?
Yes, I would say he's a libertarian-ish. Okay, clearly, there are lots of things I would object to. For example, the notion of tariffs makes economically no sense, though politically it does. And there are various other things. But by and large, he seems to be willing to let people get on with their lives as much as possible. Of course, he is a whether you like it or not, he instantiates the current imperial American presidency, which has been a very bad idea. Okay, whether we like it or not. But insofar as you're going to have that one way or the other, I would prefer somebody like Trump in there than the recent incumbent. Yes, and he's done very good things. So, for example, I mean, his office is now they've taken they've trained their guns on the whole gender identity nonsense, and in its promotion by government agencies. Again, look, for example, let me just make this point: if somebody who's an adult thinks that they have a problem which can be solved by hormone therapy or surgery, they're free to go and do it. Okay, that's being a libertarian. It's not my business. But children are another matter, right? And indeed, the harnessing of your tax money to provide for what would seem to be the support of a very strange affliction is quite bizarre. That's not the only thing the state does, by the way, waste your money on, but and so on. So all of this has been targeted, and reduction in the number of civil service, those people who would
Right.
not have it.
You got to be loving that.
Oh yeah, it's great. I mean, look, nurses will have a job whether or not the state exists, whether or not there is a state-operated health system. Okay, right? So even if they are actually paid by the state right now, nonetheless, they would still exist in the society. But there are people, for example, those people who staff the Department of whatever it is, the tax people, they would not have a job. Okay, and in fact, most people working in government would not have a job, including, by the way, our great leaders, right? Who, by the way, help themselves quite generously to our money. So
That's for sure.
and yeah, they tend not to go short. Okay, you have to be impressed by the fact that in a country of our size, where the constitution says you can't have more than 15 cabinet ministers, we somehow end up with 38 or 40, effectively, because they're called super junior ministers and they can do everything ministers can do except vote. But since nobody appears to have voted in the cabinet since 1969, this isn't as big a drawback as you might think. So it looks as if we have managed to achieve, despite the constitution, effectively 3 to 4 times the size of cabinets we're supposed to have. Anyway, that's just an example. They're in a sense trivial. The most important thing is that the state is not your friend and it doesn't love you.
Trump's commitment to free speech would obviously be something important to you.
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure. Again, time will tell how strong that is and how committed he is to it, and so on. But I have to say, I mean, I was rooting for him, and anybody who's been reading my post will know, and so on. Even with all the reservations I have about the state in general, and so on, nonetheless, when you take it that this is the world in which we live, and it's not a choice between some awful system and some libertarian system, but something that is moving more in that direction. And clearly it makes sense to be happy about moving in that direction, even if you wish it would go further and faster.
Okay. Aidan, I'll let you jump in there.
Hi, Owen. Yeah, it's just on the Gerard. Thank you very much for that. Wow, that's a fair lot to take in. Just in relation to the speakers, just in order, Owen, it's John, Misha, and Martin. John had his hand up for a very, very long time there.
Well spotted, Aidan. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just took a note on who was in. So if you just want to grab the people in that order, and
Brilliant, Aidan.
And John, he's got the heart out there already. I know he was waiting for a mic for a long time. So John, go ahead, unmute yourself there.
Thanks very much, Aidan. And yeah, Owen and Gerard, it's a real, I hold you both in very high regard, so it's a real pleasure to be in here. Thanks very much for hosting the space. It's you've done a very good job of it.
Appreciate
myself,
that.
you're very welcome, Owen. Mean every word. But I suppose myself politically, quite young in my political days, so I'm still kind of looking to figure out an ideology, that kind of way. Still haven't fully, I have some ideas obviously, but I haven't fully started to figure it out yet. And I think there's a lot of pros to libertarianism, and Gerard has only helped me to tonight in figuring out that as well. But I would be honest, I would have a few kind of respectful reservations as well that I wouldn't mind ask Gerard on if he'd be so kind to answer. And what I'd prerequisite this with Gerard is I don't necessarily believe this. It's just a post I saw. It's just sort of an observation more than anything. So I have two sort of concepts that I'd like to ask you on. But the first one is I saw a post one time, and again I don't completely believe this. It's just something I saw, an observation, I suppose, that the Irish, the Great Irish Hunger, or the famine, as many would call it, some have criticised that as that was a form of libertarianism by the British government. So I suppose I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And the second one is Javier Milei, a former economist, is now in charge of, is now the president of Argentina. And by all accounts, he's doing good stuff, I'm sure. But just according to Al Jazeera there, and look, I'm not sure is Al Jazeera the best source in the world, but they've said that the blunt of that basically poverty has surged by 53% in the first half of 2024, up from 40% in 2023. And Milei, would be a very libertarian thinker. So again, Gerard, I'm not at all married to these. These aren't my opinions. It's just a few reservations I have, I suppose. And I'd be interested to hear your sort of rebuttals to them, if you wouldn't mind. And yeah, that's it for me, lads. Thanks very much for having me up.
Thank you very much, John. Look, I do the best I can and try to keep it as short as possible so that other people can get in. First of all, in reference to the Great Hunger and so on, it's very difficult to apply the criteria of libertarianism to a situation which had been produced by statism for over a period of 500 years, which in Irish history, as we all know, involved expropriation of land, and so on. So you had a system there which had been created by legal means and maintained by legal means, and the result of the potato blight and the effect it had on the population takes place in this context. You can't just say, well, let everything rip in that context, because we don't have a libertarian society at this stage anyway. Right. So there's no point in really in sort of pointing the fickle finger of scorn at libertarianism at what it wasn't even a fully functional laissez-faire system, by the way. In other words, if anyone thinks that the situation in mid-19th century Ireland was laissez-faire, they've got another thought coming. Okay, there's never been a situation in which the situation in modern Ireland, or in Britain for that matter, has been completely laissez-faire. So that's the short answer to that. In relation to Javier Milei in Argentina, yes, he's explicitly a libertarian, and what he is doing is, again, I can't comment in detail on any specific aspect of this, because I only read what you read and so on, I'm not there. But he is systematically, as it were, involving himself in a process of deconstruction of the state. You see, you have this kind of paradox that anyone who gets involved in libertarianism as a form of political action, and say as a libertarian party or libertarian leader, finds themselves in this situation in which if they achieve their ends, they wouldn't be there. Okay? The whole point is to get rid of themselves. And therefore, what he's doing is he's reducing the government, he's reducing the bureaucrats, he's reducing the taxation, and he's maximizing freedom. And inevitably, I mean, I made the point earlier on that if you do some of these things with excessive speed, you are likely to get disruption of various kinds. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were, and if some people came out on the rough end of the stick. But in the end, he's going in the right direction, and that is the right way to go. And Argentina, in its past, was effectively the richest country in the whole of South America, and it was not the basket case it has been in recent history. And the chances are that if what I read is correct, he has actually managed to remedy its financial situation, its fiscal situation, in a remarkably short time.
John, thanks a million for getting on there and asking a question. John is a terrific young fella. He's highly involved in politics, and I just love hearing that, getting up and saying, I'm forming my political opinion. It's just terrific to hear this, you know. Good man, John, and keep at it. We need curious young minds like yours. Misha.
Owen, if I could jump in just for a quick second to just add a little bit to what John said. And I couldn't help but note he's referenced Al Jazeera and whether or not they're a right source. Well, you know, nowadays, who knows, John? I mean, it's very hard. My simple philosophy in that, John, is just look at them all and see what they're saying. But as to Gerard's point, from what I understand, and this is from writers, and they're not necessarily the best sources in the world, and they certainly wouldn't be fans of Javier Milei either, in my opinion. But even they have stated that he's already recorded a budget surplus in 2024, which is an incredible achievement. And then from AP News, and I was looking at this only recently, that he's reduced the inflation from rates. They did decrease something from 25% to 2.7%. And that was what AP News were saying. So, and of course, he also got rid of about 30,000 people from the public workforce as well, which got a lot of applause from their own people. So I think you'd also agree that he certainly elevated Argentina on the global stage, and his second dump on Davos, as I would call it, was a very interesting discussion that he gave for the second time at the World Economic Forum. So again, I think you're right, John. You know, I mean, it's horses for courses on the news, and Al Jazeera is one that I'm always looking at as well. But there's definitely different sides to what you've read as well. That's just something I wanted to throw in there, because I'm a fan, and I've been following Javier Emile for quite a long time.
Thanks, Aidan. Misha, welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello. So I might be a bit of the opposite to John, being on the older side of the shortly, and having actually been a libertarian in the late 90s. So I'm aware of these debates, and I could take things down 10 different rat holes. But I decided to just pick two questions, being conscious of time.
Thank you.
One is to libertarianism in general. The discussion, or rather a specific idea that private groups could provide security. People debating that somewhere out there, like in America, often discuss 90s Somalia. Gerard mightn't have been looking at 90s Somalia. And we have something much closer here. We have a number of groups in Ireland, some of them styling themselves IRA, others styling themselves loyalists, and yet others not particularly styling themselves political, high from Limerick, that did purport to provide security in certain areas. And I wonder how Gerard evaluates that experience. Number two is about Gerard's views versus libertarianism. Until about 2014, libertarianism meant open borders. And it certainly meant open borders when I was a libertarian. I'm not going to discuss why I stopped being one, because rat holes. But now a lot of people call themselves libertarians, and then do a thing that I can't get my head around. Everything the state does in a coercive way, from roads to education, is around and attack the state for not doing enough coercion to keep people out. How does that make sense? How does the non-aggression principle even work with opposition to immigration? But as the simple fact of immigration isn't an aggression, it isn't even a trespass, as the country is not private property. So that's my second question. Thank you very much.
All right, very good. Okay. First of all, I mean, the first question had to do with, you said some groups that purported to provide private protection, and I think you had in mind things like the IRA. Clearly, but these aren't voluntary. In other words, people don't subscribe to these voluntarily, and in a community, they don't have a chance, as it were, to subscribe to some other one in opposition. These are actually alternative would-be governments in waiting, as it were. And it's what you're dealing with there is simply a dispute between two gangs of people, one of whom is in control legally, and the other who wants to be in control and is fighting for it. So that's not really an issue for libertarian. That's a problem. The second one has to do really with the point I made earlier, which is that we live in the world that we live in right now, and in the world we live in right now, we have a situation where, for example, the movements of people is controlled or not controlled, as it were, by the state. In a libertarian world, in a fully libertarian world in which we don't live right now, you would have a situation where all property is owned by someone, and that person has the right to exclude or include whoever he wishes in that. People that do not have, as it were, the freedom to move into a particular place just by virtue of the fact that they would like to be there. They have to have the permission of the owner. Just as right now, if you have a house, you own the house, and people who come, the only people who are admitted to your house are the people that you permit to do so. In a situation where there are no states, every piece of property is owned by somebody, and therefore the situation of immigration would become a private matter for the individual owners of property. It would be no state. If you wanted to invite people from wherever it is into your property or allow them to come, that would be entirely your business. It would not necessarily be the business of anybody else, and they would not have the right to move, as it were, freely into the property of somebody else who did not wish this to happen. So that's how it works in principle in libertarianism.
Thanks very much, Misha. Very good questions. And Martin.
I own an aid in a fantastic space, and I love Gerard. Just before I ask Gerard my question, I want to just quickly address something John said about still forming his opinion and his ideology. John, I'm much older than you, and I'm still forming my opinion. So don't ever stop looking. Don't ever stop. And be very careful of ideology. You said the word ideology. The second you're captured by ideology, you stop learning. So form your own opinion, but forget ideology. It's a dark hole to go down. Sorry, I won't take. I'm conscious of time. So just to Gerard. So I would have great interest in the concept of conservative libertarianism. So I'd like to ask your opinion on that. And then the second question is the nation, not the state, is the nation of Ireland mature enough for conservative libertarianism? And then the third question would be, if such a party existed, would you be involved in it? Thank you.
Oh, so I'm sorry, I missed the first question. The first question was?
So the first question was your thoughts on conservative. There's many different forms of libertarianism. So I'm specifically asking about a very conservative strain of libertarianism, which would be, and then the second part would be, are we mature enough as a nation, as a people, to adopt conservative libertarianism? And then,
okay, no, those are great questions. The first thing is, I said at the start that libertarianism was a very simple principle, and it was consistent with any political or social system which didn't violate the principle of non-aggression or zero aggression. So, and that means that you can have people can organize their lives in whatever way they agree. If they want to organize it in a socialistic way, they're free to do that. If they want to organize it in a free market way, they're free to do that as well. They may not all survive, but that's another story. So can you be a conservative and a libertarian? And the answer is yes, but you can't be a political libertarian. Sorry, you can't be a political conservative. I tried to make that point earlier when I was talking about my discussion with the late Roger Scruton, because a political conservative is contesting for control of the state to implement his ideas of what the good life is and to insist that others abide by those dictates. You can't be a libertarian if you do that. But you can be a social conservative. That's to say, you can think that the material ends that the political libertarian is contesting for are good, but they should be brought about by the free choice of people and not by coercion. So that's the first one. The second question you ask is, are we mature enough as a nation for something like this? And my cynical answer is no. Okay, but I don't know. I mean, it's I would say that our history, our political history, is such that we have never really participated in the larger systems of political thought that have been endemic in Europe for quite a time. Our position on the geographical position on the periphery of Europe and our political position as an adjunct of the United Kingdom has prevented us from, if you like, developing our own particular thoughts on this. And even our relatively a relative form of independence since 1922 hasn't allowed us, because our political system here consisted of a squabble between the two contesting parties in relation to their attitude to the Treaty of 1922, hasn't really allowed us to develop anything like a coherent political philosophy. Most people, I would think, many people in Ireland anyway, if not most, think very little about politics or political philosophies in any way. And even the sort of standard left-right divide doesn't really have much purchase here in Ireland. So the answer is a sort of qualified negative to your second question. How to change that is a good question. Would I have anything to do with it? Probably not, because I'm going to be dead very shortly. I imagine I don't planning on living any longer, much longer than maybe another 10 years, if my genetics are anything to go by. And so this is really a matter for people like John, young people who are thinking about their future and thinking about these things. And they will carry the message forward. What happens is anyone's guess. But I suspect, without being grim, I suspect I won't be around to see it.
And do you want to follow up there, Martin? I see you unmuted. Are you happy?
No, I was just going to say thank you for the answer. It's fantastic. I would agree, but I suppose I'm a little bit younger than you, Gerard, so I still have hope.
Well, all joking aside, Gerard, you better keep your bum in the seat and keep writing books and leave something for the next generation. Very important. You've already done amazing work. You've already left a lot, but listen, you're not going to get off that easy.
No.
James.
Hi, thanks, Owen. Hi, Gerard. James Murphy. It's a pity what you just said, because my question was going to be, what kind of strategy would you propose would be good starting steps to get Ireland towards that place where it is more open and appropriate, and suitable for libertarianism to develop?
Yeah, look, it's a difficult question. I mean, somebody once said that this is a sort of Jewish joke. If you get two Jews together, you get three synagogues. Okay, so, and somebody once commented about Ireland that the first item on the agenda of any Irish political organisation is the split. So the difficulty is that the core principle of libertarianism is so simple that people can subscribe to it while they have very different views. I mean, for example, a very different social views. So trying to get together something like a libertarian party is very difficult, because you're going to find it very difficult to get people who are all libertarians to agree on particular policies. I would think that the first thing to do would be to try and get as many people together as possible to who are interested to talk about it and to learn about it. And then if not all of them can be brought on board, to form a sort of small group where you would sit down or you could even do it without sitting down, to think about how you might make a political intervention by having minimal policies which you thought would be practically achievable, and agree on those without going for very grandiose and complicated situations. That would be at least a start. The history of the Libertarian Party in the United States isn't particularly encouraging. They've been at it for quite a while, and it tends to be populated by people who are on the left side, using the left as the liberal side of the perspective. And that's whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it is only one aspect of libertarianism, and they find it very hard to, as it were, agree on policies. You come back to the key point here, of course, is that libertarianism is radically, in a sense, opposed to the political systems we have. And for it to function in any effective way in the systems we have, it has to compromise, at least temporarily, on what it thinks can be done.
I think it's time to wrap it up. We've kept Gerard on here for over an hour, for an hour and 40 minutes now. And obviously, like I said, I could do 100 spaces with Gerard and just scratch the surface, but we'll let him off the hook for tonight. Yeah, Ray. I would like to thank you, Professor Gerard Casey, for coming on here tonight, and just, your breadth of knowledge is astonishing. If you don't mind, I'd like to recommend to everyone that they pick up a copy of your book, Libertarian Anarchy. I have a copy of it here in my hand. I'm getting through it this week, and it's fantastic. Just a fantastic and readable introduction to libertarian anarchy. I want to thank everyone who came up here and asked terrific questions. And most importantly, I want to thank everyone in the room here for sticking with us and being part of this tonight. Gerard, is there anything you would like to add before we wrap up? And I'll hand over to Aidan then to say his piece.
No, just to thank everybody for listening in. I see a remarkable number of people here. You're all gluttons for punishment, and you deserve everything you get. No, but seriously, thank you for listening in, and I hope you found some of it useful. Okay.
Very good, Gerard. Thank you very much. Yeah, what a great night. And actually, I wish we had more in for Gerard. And delighted to say this is all recorded, and I'm sure Owen will snip the best snippets out of it as well. And also the entire recording will be available on YouTube as well. Correct, Owen?
That's right, Aidan. This will be up tomorrow on YouTube.
Very good. Okay, well, we better get to work on that. I suppose just to finally say thank you again to Gerard, and thanks indeed to everyone for the questions, Bart and John and James and all. And thank you all very much for your patience in prior events where we were unable to get Gerard on. So finally we got it correct, and hopefully we can have Gerard back again for some more. Many thanks to you all. Have a great evening.